If you have your Bible, I would ask everyone, if you would have a Bible, please take it and open it, please. We'll turn to the book of Genesis. Genesis is easy to find. It's the first book. That'll help. We're going to turn to Genesis chapter 41. Some American soldiers during the Korean War were hired a local man to do their housekeeping in their abode where these guys were living. The Korean had a very positive attitude. He was always smiling. The Americans were always playing tricks on him, though. They would nail his shoes to the floor. They would grease the stove handles. They would put buckets of water over the doorway. When he would open, they would plunge on him. Finally, they were so ashamed of their treatment of him that because he always responded with a very positive attitude and smile, and they thought, well, we're never going to trick him again. Your attitude has been so outstanding, they told him, and so we won't do it anymore. And so the Korean man said, you mean no more nail shoes to floor? Or no more sticky on the stove knob? Nope, none of that. No more buckets on the door? And they said, no, no more. With that, the smile came upon the Korean man, who then said, okay then, no more spit and soup. We can look nice on the outside, and yet we are still spitting in the soup. There was a survey that was taken of people who were 95 years of age. Almost Andrew made that. They were asked one open-ended question that they were asked to answer, and the question was, if you could live your life over again, what would you do differently? Or what would you do? And there were numerous responses. The top three were, I would take more time to reflect, I would take more time to take a risk, or I would do more things that would live on after I'm gone. Former Dallas Cowboy football star is a guy named Deion Sanders. He gave his heart to Christ after a little bit of rebellion and while living in his life. Sanders said, I was the fastest man in football. I was the fastest man in baseball because he played both sports. And even I could not outrun God. And by the way, none of us ever will. We think that we are able to do that, but we won't make it. Joseph may have wanted to run away from God. Remember, Joseph is in prison in chapter 41. His crime was resisting the sexual offer of Potiphar's lustful wife. He's now stayed in prison, I think, for 12 years, and he's been in there with committing no crime. So Joseph may have concluded that God was through with him and had chosen the prison as his lifelong address. Pagans didn't really care about, what he was doing. I mean, if he's in prison, he's in prison. But Joseph experienced all of what was taking place in that prison, the awful food, the awful smells, and the stench, for which the prison guards really didn't care. And surely God had more for him, he thought, but it's 12 years I've been in prison. When is God going to do something? But then God does do something. We have a Pharaoh, and he has a dream. And Joseph suddenly finds himself in demand. And there are some lessons that we can learn. They're listed on the back of your bulletin if you want to follow along. And what God is going to do with him, and what God is trying to do with us during times that are tough. Are we experiencing tough times here? I think that there may be that kind of experience that will happen to us as believers in terms of the times that we live in. First of all, number one is the willingness to be humble in the darkness. We need to learn the lessons in the darkness, many times the diamonds that we find in the darkness, that there are benefits that come only through struggles. I agree with A.W. Tozer. A.W. Tozer was a pastor in the 1950s in the city of Chicago. And he said the statement this way: "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply." Doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has been hurt deeply. I agree with that. I don't like it, but I agree with it. I can mention numerous examples. You can go through the book, all of the books of the Bible, and you'll see that aspect of hurt. But I think in some ways it is Joseph that we see here. We're in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. Lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fair. They grazed in the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after the Nile, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. And then Pharaoh awoke. The Pharaoh of the land has a dream. He sees these 7 fat, healthy cows that are eating there on the marsh of the Nile. And then here comes 7 ugly, gaunt, starving cows that also come out, and they eat up the fat, healthy cows. And so Pharaoh wakes. He's probably thinking, man, what did I have for supper? And it's sort of upsetting to him to see this kind of thing. And before long, though, he falls asleep again and has another dream. And the second dream, you'll see the passage there, is the stalk of grain. And one is plump and healthy, and then there are 7 lean ears that are scorched from the wind, and they devour the 7 healthy ears of grain. So Pharaoh wakes and he remembers this dream, and it disturbs him. Verse 8, it came about in the morning that his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all of his magicians or wise men, and Pharaoh told him the dream, and there was no one among them that could interpret the dream. So it's at this point that a guy who was called the cupbearer, had been in prison. If you have followed the story of Joseph, he had been in prison at the same time Joseph was, and Joseph gives an understanding of the dream that the cupbearer has, and it's found in those chapters. And the cupbearer has now gone back to the throne room to be the cupbearer for the king, for the Pharaoh. Well, he forgot all about Joseph, all those 13 years, or those 12 years, and now he remembers when he hears about nobody can interpret the dream, and he says this to Pharaoh. And of course Pharaoh wants to meet his Hebrew slave named Joseph. And he summoned him from the cell. And so the darkness of all of Joseph's life has now begun to sort of come forth with a purpose. And God's plan was about to surface, and it was exciting. The nation is going to be affected by this. And Joseph is going to tell Pharaoh about this, about what the interpretation is and what he's about to do. In other words, he is humble even in the midst of this darkness. A guy named Tom McGee of Tulsa, Oklahoma was driving while drinking one night, and his car collided with a car driven by Ted Morris, who is the only son of Jack and Elizabeth Morris. The Morrises were devastated and bitter by the loss of their son in the crash. They made sure that Tom McGee was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. He was sent to jail, but later he was paroled. So the Morrises took it upon themselves to hound him and find out whether he'd ever done anything more wrong. And they found him doing something illegal, and so they got him rearrested, and he was sent back to jail. In other words, it seemed like the bitterness that they had about their son being killed was taking over their lives. But as Christians, when they decided to forgive Tom McGee, the husband Jack went to the prison and talked with him there and told him, "We're going to forgive you. We're not going to hound your steps anymore. You're free." Jack would later come back and visit Tom again in the prison, and with this time he even brought cookies from his wife Elizabeth that she had made. Tom was released on a weekend pass and was invited by the Morrises to come to their house for dinner. He came, he spent the night, he attended church with them, and the next morning he sat in the same pew with them, and when the invitation was given, he walked forward and accepted Christ and was also baptized. That isn't the end of the story, though. Jack and Elizabeth Morris adopted Tom McGee as their own son. And he stands in line then now to inherit all of their worldly possessions. In other words, Satan meant it for evil, and God did something in this man and wife that they were willing to forgive. The humbleness in the darkness. Number 2 is humbleness and promotion. Learning to listen to those wise people around you. Joseph was God's man, and Pharaoh would be well to listen to him. When godly men talk, we need to listen carefully. And especially when you're going through hard times, you need godly counsel from wise people. Godly men have character that is recognizable. Look at Joseph. Look at verse 38. We see that he has a divine spirit in him. In verse 39, he has a discerning and wisdom in his life. In verse 40, he is one who respects authority. In other words, we see what Joseph had turned out like. And Pharaoh says of Joseph, I'm even going to give you this ring, which was basically a document for stamping on documents. But it was also a sign of authority, in that Joseph was now second in command. In other words, God was now doing something in Joseph's life in an unprecedented way. By the way, some of you are on that verge. Some of you are on the verge of being promoted. You don't even know it. Because God doesn't announce it ahead of time. What you have to do while you wait is to believe in His promises. In other words, while you are in that experience like what Joseph was, in a dungeon, and yet Joseph by faith trusts Him to bring light even into his dungeon experience. In the winter of our discontent, we believe there is a spring. And Pharaoh heard that there was someone who could do something for him. He had this dream problem. He naturally says, well, I hear somebody can do this, go get him. And remember, Joseph knew nothing about what's going on. He's just walking into the king, into Pharaoh's palace. He had no idea what was happening. He was back in the dungeon. All of a sudden, he finds himself being pulled up out of the pit. There's an interesting side like this here. When Pharaoh sends for Joseph, the guards quickly go and get him out of the dungeon. And instead of rushing him into Pharaoh's presence, what does Joseph do? He goes and shaves himself. Probably had a beard, scraggly hair, and all the other things. The Egyptians were clean-shaven type people, at least those that were wealthy, and also he put on new clothes. And so Joseph prepared himself to meet the king. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. I've heard it. I heard that you can do that. When you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. In other words, Pharaoh says, according to my sources, you're able to do this kind of thing. In other words, Pharaoh says, tell me what my dream means, and I'll make it worth your while. And Joseph responds by saying, well, now wait a minute. I don't have the answers, but I serve a God who does. As the NIV translates it here, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Again, here you talk about humility, and you talk about integrity. It's not me, it's God. Joseph said, no, I'm not the one with the answers, but I serve the God who is, and we'll both listen to him, and he will tell us what he wants us to learn. In other words, you know why Joseph would be so humble and speak so openly? Because he had gone through experiences in his own life of having his heart broken. He saw it with his brothers. He saw it with Potiphar's wife. He saw it with the cupbearer in prison, but they had all forgotten about him. He had been tried by fire, he had gone through the affliction, because while his external circumstances seemed almost unbearable during all of what he's going through, there's an internal thing that's going on, is that God is doing something in his heart. And God is changing him and putting him in an opportunity to be used for him. We are now witnessing the benefits of enduring affliction when you keep your eyes on God. And throughout the rest of Joseph's life, from age 30 all the way to 110 when he dies, we will never hear one word of resentment. Not a word of blame about what his brothers did, not a blame about Potiphar's wife, not a blame about the cupbearer for getting him. And Joseph was eventually in a position where he could get even with all of them. And he didn't do it. Joseph was mature enough to know the high cost of getting even. Dale Carnegie told of seeing a grizzly bear eating some garbage in Yosemite National Park. And he said, the grizzly bear has no one to fear. He is the biggest animal in the continental United States. And if a deer or a fox came over and tried to eat the garbage where the grizzly bear was at, the grizzly could just basically smack them and they would run away. But as Carnegie was watching, a skunk came out of the woods. And started to eat right next to the bear eating the garbage. Carnegie concluded, now that grizzly could have destroyed that skunk easily, but he didn't do it because he knew the high cost of getting even. Job 18, you fear yourselves, or you tear yourself to pieces in your anger. You're trying to get even, but it's tearing you apart. The Bible tells us that. And after Joseph heard about this dream, he said, through me, God is going to give you the answer. I'm just the messenger. And there proceeds the interpretation of the dream that Pharaoh has. And Joseph says that both dreams mean the same. Egypt is going to experience 7 years of abundance. In other words, there's going to be bumper crops. And after that will come 7 years of famine, in which, it's interesting, in which you won't even remember the years of abundance. Not only will God's plan have been carried out, but you can count on this, God's timing will take place. It's interesting that Joseph had some words of counsel, chapter 41, verse 33. And now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. In other words, along with this recommendation, he also gives some very specific words, the words of advice for procedures that Pharaoh should use. Egypt is going to need a very strict, well-organized rationing process. As all of you know, where you have plenty, you eat plenty, and you spend plenty, and you don't save. So Joseph says you need to have a man who can take responsibility for managing these 7 years of fruitfulness. A man who will oversee and build up granaries and make certain that there's a portion of abundance each year that's stored away. In other words, because when the famine strikes and wipes out all the fertile land around here in Egypt, therefore we need, your people will be able to still live. And therefore you need a person in charge of that. You need a good manager. What's interesting about Joseph is never once does he say, I'm the guy. We see again humbleness. Even though he didn't say, I interpreted the dream, I deserve the job. Verse 37, now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants, and Pharaoh said to the servants, can we find a man like this with a divine spirit? It's interesting what he says is Joseph is standing right in front of him. But even then, when it seemed appropriate for Joseph to volunteer, he doesn't. The king, however, knows what Joseph has done. He knows he's the man for the job. And so what we have here, verse 39, is humility is promoted. Pharaoh says to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house according to your command. All my people shall do homage to you. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. You are impressed by Joseph's self-control. Joseph refuses to promote himself, and how refreshing that's interesting to see, isn't it? How many times have you maneuvered? How many times have you maneuvered? I'm going to get in this. I'm going to get that piece of meat, or I know. In other words, how many times have you maneuvered yourself into something? And isn't that later in life the thing that you regret and you remember? Yeah, I got this job because... But that's not the kind of promotion that Joseph wants. If God was in it, God will do it. That's what you've always said, right? If God's in it, He'll take care of it. And that's precisely what did happen. God was in it, God did it. Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God told you all of this, obviously, therefore I'm putting you in command of everything. It's interesting that you look at Joseph and he's still got mud on his hands. Only a few hours before this, Joseph was a scraggly, ragged, forgotten prison in the dungeon. Now all of a sudden he's royally dressed. He's got a gold necklace around his neck. He has a ring on his finger from the Pharaoh, and he is riding in a fabulous chariot. And as he's riding with the Pharaoh in the chariot, people are bowing down. Bow down to the Pharaoh and to Joseph. You know what this sounds like? You ever heard of the song? You ever heard of the story Cinderella? In many ways, that's what's going on here. But when God determines the time is right, that's the way He operates. Verse 46. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before the king. Interesting to know. We'll turn back to that. Number 3. Let's humble ourselves in times of reward. In an instant, Joseph was rewarded for his character, which had been developed during these previous years and even in the prison. In other words, God had a plan for Joseph and his life. And although, like many of us, Joseph may have thought, well, this was the plan I had. And it's very interesting that many times we have the plan plotted out for our lives, the way we think that it should go. And our plans may not be God's plans. So now here's the son of Jacob, who is now wealthy, has authority, has power. You know, it's interesting. It would be interesting. What would it be like if Joseph dropped by our church? Or let's go even further. What if it was a Joseph that was already in church? What if there was a man in church and all of a sudden all of this fell upon him? What would we think about that person? Would it be difficult for us to be affirming of someone's success? Or would we look at him with a jaw and say, how in the world did he get that? And where did he get that power and that influence? Who does he think he is? Okay, we don't do that kind of stuff. And yet Scripture never, it's interesting, Scripture never says that Joseph expected people to bow before him either. In fact, I tend to think that Joseph was sort of embarrassed that, you guys can get up, man, what? Because this was a man who had scars from slavery. And now he's going through the streets with Pharaoh and people are falling down. I think that it reminds me of Paul's words that he now has learned the secret of having abundance. What a responsibility, what a burden, especially for a man who's only 30 years old. I remember when 30 seemed like over the hill game. When I went to college, by the way, we were told don't trust anybody over 30. Now it seems miraculously young. But let me just say, youth does not necessarily obliterate usefulness. In fact, the Bible is filled with youthful people in positions of leadership and influence. When David was anointed, by Samuel. The first time he was anointed to be the king, he was probably under 20. He was 30 when he finally became king. When Daniel was picked by King Nebuchadnezzar to be one of the top guys in his government, remember, Daniel was only a teenager. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. I don't know if I'd want to be around for that one, but and the Virgin Mary, giving birth to the Christ, probably was a teenager also. In other words, compared to some of those folks, Joseph is an old man. He's 30, he's at the top. And he's got a signet ring, and he's got a necklace, and he's got garments, and he has gone from the pit to the palace, from the dungeon to the throne room, and thankfully, he has continued to maintain his humility. A Scottish preacher and writer named Alexander White writes this about Joseph. Joseph was now going to be plunged into the most corrupt society that rotted in that age, in that time, on the face of the earth. And through it all, Joseph had become a better person, or even a better person, a more noble person. And in other words, more and more he became more trustworthy. More and more he became more a person to talk to consult with, because people trusted him. To Joseph, that God is raising up in his generation, Josephs are being raised up in our generation. May they continue to walk with God. May we generously use our affluence and our authority, your influence, your success, that says this is all because of what God has done. It's not anything about me, it's what God has done, and how we need that kind of leadership even in our own day today. Remember, the message of Jesus Christ cuts across all kinds of status and success. It doesn't make a difference what salary you have, or what lifestyle you have, or what car you drive, or where you live, or where you work. In some ways that matters maybe for dealing with position with people, but that has nothing to do with your position before God. Joseph is 30 years old. He stands before the king. He's been in prison, or he has been in Egypt for 13 years. 13 years waiting for things to change. 13 years of setback after setback. And yet you read this account and you don't see any of that in terms of the discouragement that we see in his life. Go to verse 50. It's interesting that Joseph will now have 2 sons. He has been given a wife. It's interesting that the first name of the first son is the name Manasseh. It's from a Hebrew word which means to forget. By naming his first son Manasseh, Joseph is saying, God has made me forget. How delighted he must have been just to see his firstborn and to see his son and say, God has Manasseh me. In other words, he has removed the sting from my memory. And then you go on and you see the second son is named Ephraim, and another play on words in the original means to be twice fruitful. Now he has 2 sons. He's twice fruitful. God has Ephraim me. In other words, he has blessed me beyond measure in a place that once seemed to bring only suffering. That's the way Joseph now looks at this. Joseph gave his children names that would reveal his humble attitude. In other words, his children were reminders of what God's activity was in his life. God has made. God has given. There's a warning here for all of us. It's very tempting to try to get even with Reubens and Judahs and Dans and Mrs. Potiphar's. To get back at people that have stung us. Instead, we need to get Manasseh. Could it be that God is asking you that? Is God desiring to erase those stings, those memories? And only He can do that. Let me close with this. One of the things that you look at this passage and you say, well, why is Joseph considered great? Why does the Spirit of God spend so much time on Joseph's life? You have chapters before this, you'll have chapters after this. In fact, he is talked about more than any other person in the book of Genesis, even more than Abraham. What is there about Joseph that could cause the Lord to spend so much time telling Moses, you need to write more about this guy? Because Joseph is the one who, or Moses is the one that wrote the Pentateuch. In other words, make a careful record of this man's life so that all generations can see this. Understand this, Joseph wasn't superhuman. He was merely a man. He never walked on water. He had no halo. He never performed a miracle. He certainly wasn't free from trouble, nor was he untarnished and untouchable. With the Lord's help, he was able to, well, he interpreted a dream, but he made no awesome prophecies. He never wrote a word of Scripture. Why is Joseph so great? He is great, dear people, because of his faith in God, which manifested itself in a magnanimous attitude toward others and a magnificent attitude toward difficulties. A magnanimous attitude toward others and a magnificent attitude toward difficulties. And I believe that when a strong faith happens, it leads to a good attitude. A strong faith leads to a good attitude. And when those two essentials are in place, troubles become challenges to face, but not reasons to quit. God's purpose in Joseph was to remove any hint of the fleshly temper and volatile demeanor and replace that with a peaceful, godly respect, a discernment. God desired to illustrate in Joseph what he desires to illustrate in you. That what Christ is like, and with that we can become fruitful in following of God. Verse 52, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Tough times are coming. Has God prepared you for the times yet ahead? Let's bow and pray. We thank you, our God, that our dependence, our rest is in you. In the way that you took Joseph through all of these circumstances that happened in his life, the ups and downs that he experienced, and yet he did not dissuade him from his trust in you. And the spirit that you put within him in terms of how he treated other people. And then you gave him wise discernment in how he would save the land of Egypt and so many other people too. Lord, we're mindful that our responsibility is to put our trust in you. And with that trust, that will have an effect upon our attitude and the way we treat others. May you demonstrate your power in our lives as we desire to follow you the way Joseph did. In Jesus' name.